Israel said the ambulances were being used to carry Hamas terrorists and Hamas weapons. Every human rights organization investigated that allegation very closely. They all concluded the same thing. There's no evidence that Hamas was using the ambulances to transport terrorists or weapons. In fact, Israel's own emergency ambulance service, Magen David Adom, Israel's own ambulance service, testified before Mr. Goldstone. They themselves testified the ambulances were not misused by Hamas. Nonetheless, Israel targeted them. That's not a controversial question. In fact, it's so uncontroversial that if you read Israel's own defense of what it did in Gaza, when it comes to the question of the ambulances, the only defense they had was there was one report, that one ambulance driver said that Hamas militants attempted to hijack his ambulance, but were unsuccessful. So by Israel's own admission, none of the ambulances was carrying weapons or Hamas militants, or they have no evidence, they admitted. The hospitals, Israel damaged or destroyed 15 hospitals in Gaza. Israel said there were Hamas militants hiding in the hospitals. All the human rights organizations investigated that claim. They found no evidence that Hamas militants were using the hospitals. Israel systematically attacked the mosques in Gaza. That's a pretty awful thing to do, to attack the sacred houses of worship of a religion. Well, Israel said there were weapons stored in those mosques. On its face, it would mean Hamas was very stupid, because the mosques were under surveillance all the time by the Israelis. Why would you store weapons which were very scarce? Hamas did not have a very big arsenal, as became clear during those 22 days. Why would you store them in a place that's being constantly watched by Israel, when there were places where it was much easier to hide the weapons? But then there was another problem that arose. Israel systematically targeted the minarets on the mosques. Why? The minarets are very narrow, and so it was impossible for Palestinian militants to climb them and use them for surveillance. They also do not have stairs. So the Dugard Committee, the committee headed by the distinguished South African jurist John Dugard, excuse me, no problem. He said the minarets were targeted for one reason, because they symbolized Islam. That was his conclusion. across the board, none of the Israeli claims held up when human rights organizations investigated them. Most significantly, Amnesty International, Richard Goldstone, they found no evidence that Hamas used civilians as human shields. All of you, I'm sure, have heard the claim that Hamas used civilians as human shields. I wonder how many of you are aware that Amnesty International carefully investigated that question and concluded we found no evidence that Palestinians used Hamas used civilians as human shields. On the other hand, all the human rights organizations found vast amounts of evidence that Israel used Palestinians as human shields in Gaza. And as you may have noticed, when the video was describing what happened in 2002 in Israel's so-called Operation Defensive Shield, it said human shields. That's what Israel always does. There was no evidence that Hamas did that. Let me now turn to the last aspect of the conflict, because time is past what I promised, and that's how to resolve the conflict. And we're all told it's such a complicated conflict. Maybe everything is true about Israel's human rights record, and maybe it's true that Israel is more aggressive than we thought. But you have to acknowledge that resolving the conflict is complicated, as the media likes to say, controversial. So you have to judge for yourself. And here again, we have what you might call an mathematical proof, which it will be your job to disprove if you disagree with me. Because every year, the United Nations General Assembly, they vote on a resolution called Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question, every year in November. And the terms for resolving the conflict are the ones which I already mentioned based on international law. There has to be a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967, because you're not allowed to acquire territory by war. So Israel has to fully withdraw from Gaza, fully withdraw from the West Bank, and fully withdraw from East Jerusalem. And the settlements have to be dismantled, and there has to be a resolution of the refugee question based on the principles of international law, which are either the refugees are allowed to return to their home, or they have to be compensated for their losses. That's the terms for resolving the conflict. And every year in the General Assembly, there is a vote. Now, I will read you quickly the most recent votes. Let's start from the last 13 years. I'll just do it quickly.